Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's webinar. I'm really pleased that you can join us here in Earth Laws Month. This is actually our second last online event for Earth Laws Month, and I can see a few folks have been with us for many of those calls. So thank you so much for joining us. My name is Dr. Michelle Maloney. I'm the co-founder and national convener of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance. And in a moment, I'm going to introduce the always fabulous Professor Brendan Mackey, and we're going to talk with you about some of the climate change updates. But before we do that, I'd like to acknowledge country. I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work and play on the beautiful lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples here in the part of the world now known as North Brisbane. I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present and the emerging leaders and elders who are caring for country and continuing practices that have begun in ancient times. I'd like to recognise the remarkable civilisational culture of the first peoples who understood how to live in harmony with the living world and how to live within their space and in their territories. I'd also like to acknowledge the ongoing legacy and impacts of colonisation. I know many of you are aware of the work of AILA. I can see some familiar names. But for those who don't know, the Australian Earth Laws Alliance was created by a group of very concerned environmental lawyers who were inspired by both the theory of Earth jurisprudence, the idea that we need an Earth-centred governance system for humanity to respect the living world. And we're also inspired by the First Nations peoples of this continent and really deeply admire and respect the governance and laws and rules that they have created. AILA has also auspiced two other sister organisations, the New Economy Network Australia and Future Dreaming. And so if you get a chance, do look up those other organisations. And if you've missed any of Earth Laws Month, I will pop the link in for our program, which has been absolutely marvellous and cut across so many different topics and issues and wonderful speakers from all around the world. And all of the recordings for Earth Laws Month will be available on our website, rolling out during October. So please do backtrack and watch any of the discussions you'd like to. Without further ado, I will introduce Brendan Mackey, and I must apologise. Brendan let me know that Melissa Jackson is unwell and not able to join us. So tonight, Brendan and I thought that we would just have a relaxed discussion. I have a set number of questions I'd like to ask him as a curious citizen who really appreciates Brendan's knowledge and wisdom and wide-ranging networks, knowing what's going on in the climate change-oriented world. And then we'll have a bit of a chat. And if you've got questions as we go along, please pop them in the chat and I'll try to bring them through our conversations. What we will do to take pressure off Brendan talking for an hour and a half, we'll just aim to wrap up around 7, unless our conversations are so utterly lively that we're still keen to stay on for many, many more minutes. So without further ado, Professor Brendan Mackey is the director of the Griffith Climate Change Beacon. His background is in forest ecology, and he works across, I would see him as a really leading Australian thinker and multidisciplinary scientist and professional networker because he knows everybody, which is terrific. How are you tonight, Brendan?
I'm very well, thanks, Michelle.
Thanks for joining us, Brendan. So we've got a number of questions that you and I have, agreed that are acceptable for this conversation tonight. So I might just start with a few and then we'll see how we go. So, and just so everybody knows, what I'm personally interested in is what's going on internationally. What are the current predictions? What's Australia really doing? Many of us are trying to keep track of what the federal government's up to. It says good things, it's trying to do good things, but it's also approving fossil fuel projects, major fossil fuel projects at a time when all of that should be phased out. So what the heck is going on? And then we're going to talk a bit more about our personal and professional lives and what we can do to continue the hard work we've all been doing for a long time to do what's right and good for a safe, livable climate. So that's the big picture framing. Mr. Mackey, can you tell us a bit about what the latest IPCC analysis and predictions are for the impacts of climate change globally? And folks, I'm sorry we start with the depressing stuff, but it's really important to stay up to date with where we are and what they think is happening. Thanks, Brendan.
Yes. Thanks, Michelle, and good evening, everyone. And yeah, I'll also acknowledge the traditional owners of where I'm talking to you from, which is the southern end of the Gold Coast. So that's the Yunga and Commonwealth people. And I always like noting, you know, it's really quite remarkable and very interesting that First Nations in Australia now kind of scientifically are dated back 60,000 years. And that's interesting from a climate change point of view, because that was about, we were still in a glacial period when they came, or when those records are from, and we only got out of the last glacial into the Holocene about 18,000 years ago. So there's still in many First Nations oral history, you know, climate change, you know, stories of climate change. I'm not sure of everywhere where there are, but certainly, you know, that's well documented in I know Northern Australia and elsewhere. So, you know, along with all their other knowledge, there's also knowledge of climate change and adaptation through climate change. So I think, you know, and again, just to give, if people haven't heard this before, you know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was set up back in actually the late 80s, early 1990s, to regularly review what scientific research has found out about climate change, and to update the world community on climate science in three broad areas. The first area is what's called the physical basis. How is Earth's climate changing? How do we know, or why is it changing? How do we know it's due to what human influences? And how is it projected to change in the future with different kind of emission scenarios? That's the first report. It's called Working Group 1. The second group report, Working Group 2, looks at impacts, the observed impacts of a changing climate and projected future impacts, which are called risks, climate risks, because they're the likelihood of and consequences of things happening. The vulnerability of human and natural systems to those impacts and risks, and adaptation, which is what can we do about it, to kind of avoid or minimize those impacts and risks. The third working group looks at mitigation and what are the prospects of mitigating greenhouse gases, and what kind of emission reductions are needed, and what kind of approaches and methods are kind of possible. I was actually a coordinating lead author in Working Group 2. But I think, you know, for me, the big headline message from Working Group 1, well, you know, there's a few. You know, one is that we're currently experiencing 1.1 degree of global warming. Now, it's really important to kind of understand what that means. When we say 1.1 degree of global warming, what does it mean? Well, it's an index, and I've got a little slide here that illustrates this. Can you see that, Michelle? Can you see that?
Yes,
slide?
Brendan, but we can still see your desktop. So when you're ready, you might like to click on, or you don't have to, but.
Yeah, I think it's okay, because I'm going to jump between.
Yeah.
I've just got a bar in the middle of it, which is a bit annoying. Oh, there we go. So it's an index. So the full index is, you know, degrees of global warming above pre-industrial levels. So i.e., what was Earth's average temperature in around 1850? And you can think of that like a thermometer reading of Earth's health. Now, we know with a human, when a medical practitioner takes your body temperature with a thermometer, I think they do it in your ear these days rather than other places. That, you know, 36 to 37 degrees is a safe average body temperature for a healthy adult. 38 degrees is diagnostic of a fever, and 40 degrees is life-threatening. So if we think of the Earth temperature, well, a healthy planetary temperature is actually 0 above pre-industrial levels, right? Because that's the kind of benchmark before we started really burning lots of fossil fuels and really kind of doing extensive land clearing. And currently, and this was one of the big findings of Working Group 1, is that we're currently at 1.1 degrees of global warming above pre-industrial levels. And that's bad, because that's probably, I would say, by analogy, equivalent of the planetary fever, if I could put it that way. And I guess the bad news is, because of kind of lag effects in the Earth system, there's another 0.4 of a degree global warming locked in. So we are going to hit about 1.5 degrees global warming in around 8 to 10 years' time. So somewhere around or shortly after 2030, that index will hit 1.5. So 1.5 for many things is definitely life-threatening, which I can talk about shortly. So the point is that, every increment of global warming, every point of a degree, really represents major changes in the Earth system. And maybe the way to understand that is if we wind the clock back to the year 2002. So let's pretend I'm giving you this, we're having this discussion in the year 2002. Well, what was Earth's temperature in 2002? It was 0.6 degrees above global warming. So imagine it's 2002 and I say to you, well, it's projected that we're going to have another 0.5 degree of global warming over the next 20 years, and that in 2022, global warming would have increased from 0.6 to 1.1. And you might say, well, what could that result in? And I imagine me saying, well, within a year we're going to have the biggest drought Eastern Australia's ever seen, followed by the biggest bushfire Eastern Australia's ever seen, followed by the biggest flood Eastern Australia's ever seen. You would have all kind of laughed and said I was a scaremonger. But that's what's happened, right? We've had that much global warming has led to that much kind of climate change. And now where the science is telling us we have another 0.4 of a degree locked in within the next 10 years. So we can expect, worsening impacts and worsening risks. So that was kind of the really key messages from Working Group 1. The climate has changed, and it is going to change more. So the question is, what happens after that? Well, that's what this graph here shows. So this gone too far. So we're now here at 2020, and some time between 2020 and 2050, but it's going to be closer to 2030, where we're going to hit 1.5 degrees. What happens after that depends entirely on our successful failure to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions now and over the next decade. So if the world community were to really achieve these deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions, decarbonise our economy, stop burning fossil fuel for energy, use clean energy sources, decarbonise our transportation systems, stop deforestation, forest degradation, then it's still very possible for us to limit global warming to not below 1.5 degrees, but close to it, in that kind of lower part of that grey area. If we fail to do that, the prospects are very grim. We can have massive global warming by the end of this century and beyond. So that's kind of the global picture, Michelle. Whilst we have another significant amount of climate change locked in, it's what we do or don't fail to do now in terms of mitigating greenhouse gases that will determine whether we cap the amount of kind of global warming and climate change, or whether we just have this escalating impacts and risks. So that's kind of that's the
big picture.
That's the big picture.
Yeah, thank you, Brendan. Do you have information or up-to-date information telling us what further impacts we can expect here in Australia?
Yeah, so this is of course, predicting the future is very difficult.
Very.
if not impossible. So scientifically, IPCC, we don't use the term predict, we use project, because these are really kind of model projections. And I guess the thing to understand is the difference between what's called if you like, a climate impact driver, or if you like, the climate hazard and the impact of that hazard. So when we go to working group 2, we're actually looking at, well, the climate might be changing, but so what? What are the impacts of that on natural systems, and what are the impacts of that on human systems? And so when we look at projecting that into the future, we're really looking at the risk. What's the risk to things that we value in the natural world or the human world that will be impacted by this changing climatic conditions? And for Australia, we actually came up, this is a bit of that's a complicated diagram. I've got a kind of simplified version, which I'll go to first, hopefully. And here are kind of major kind of risks, climate risks for Australia from kind of escalating conditions. And I guess one of the ones that receives a lot of publicity is about loss and degradation of coral reefs in Australia, from marine bleaching, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Another one is increase in heat-related mortality and morbidity. Heat waves cause the most deaths of any natural disaster in Australia. And of course, one of the things about climate change is the average temperature increases, the extremes increase as well. So we're seeing hotter temperatures and more heat waves and more hotter heat waves. Coral reefs are also a heat wave related impact. So this is heat waves in the marine environment. So when you have a marine heat wave, the hot air heats the surface water, and that's bad for coral because coral exist in a symbiotic relationship with microalgae. The microalgae live in the coral and they photosynthesize and feed the coral, and they also give the coral its color. And when there's a marine heat wave above a certain temperature threshold, the microalgae die, and when that happens, the coral die because there's nothing to feed them, and because the microalgae are dead, the coral's colorless. Now, a coral reef can regenerate. Algae spores coral spores can come back, and the coral can regrow and reestablish. It takes a long time. It takes about 10 years. Now, the problem is, as with global warming, we're seeing an increase in the frequency and duration of marine heat waves. And we've already seen, I think, 4 marine heat waves in the last 5 years at the Great Barrier Reef, different parts of the Great Barrier Reef. Once we get around 1.5 degrees, you start to see them happening everywhere in the tropics every 2 to 3 years. So what that means is they are really whacked around and can't recover. So our coral reefs are already at kind of very high risk. Heat waves is already a very high risk. Our heat waves are getting worse. We're getting temperatures, commonly getting temperatures in the 40s in many parts of Australia now. And of course, the impact is also a function of the vulnerability, how vulnerable you are or how sensitive and vulnerable you are to the climate impact. Coral reefs are very sensitive to, very vulnerable to heat wave impacts. Lots of people are too. The elderly are very vulnerable to heat waves. Babies are vulnerable to heat waves. People who have to work outdoors are vulnerable to heat waves. People who live in poor housing without air conditioning or good insulation are vulnerable to heat waves. So when it comes to looking at the impacts of changing climate, you also have to look at this other factor, the vulnerability, which can be the natural vulnerability, if it's an ecosystem or a species, or if it's human system, it's often the pre-existing social economic factors that determine how exposed and vulnerable people are to impacts. Another risk for Australia and indeed many parts of the world is agricultural production. So many of you would be aware that in southern Australia is a winter rainfall zone. So the rain falls mainly in winter, and that's where we grow our wheat. So in Western Australia, southwest Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales is our winter wheat crops. And we've seen a marked decline in winter rainfall. Interestingly, total annual rainfall is not changing. You're getting a bit more in summer, but winter rainfall has decreased about 20%. In southwest WA, it's about 30%, and that trend is going to continue. So we're going to see probably another 20% decline in winter rainfall in the coming decade or so. So that's actually got a big implications for rain-fed agriculture in southern Australia. That's another risk. Well, it should be obvious, but our alpine zone is disappearing. So as for those of you who know our alpine zone, we don't have a lot of tall mountains. Our alpine zone is not very high. It's only 2,000 meters. There's nowhere above it, right? It's at the top already. So with global warming, what you're getting is the subalpine woodlands encroaching up, and the unique alpine flora is disappearing as the snow cover gets less and less and less, and as the temperature heats up. So basically, tropical coral reefs and alpine dependent biodiversity are two natural systems which are, really in serious trouble from climate change. Actually, temperate kelp forests are in trouble too. They've been really whacked also by marine heat waves. But kelp systems grow back really quickly, like in about a year, and they can migrate very quickly. So we've lost a lot, but they've all, they're if you like, they're much more naturally adaptive than tropical coral reefs. I've got some a box up here, 3 risks, climate risks into the future, which really are to do with human systems. And one of them is cascading, compounding, and aggregate impacts on city settlements, infrastructure, supply chains, and services. Well, whilst we have these, what we call climate trends of global warming and rising sea level, as those average conditions change, so do the frequency and severity and duration of all extreme weather events. So with global warming and sea level rise, we're getting an increase in the frequency and severity duration of bushfires, of heavy rainfall events and flooding, and of droughts and of tropical storms. There's just more energy in the system. There's more water being evaporated. There's more falling, and there's deeper winter droughts in particular. There's drier conditions, higher temperatures, worse fire danger. And we've seen this all come about in the last couple of years in Eastern Australia. So having a really bad drought was bad enough for Eastern Australia, but it was immediately followed by a bushfire that burned for 4 months and burned about 40 million hectares of forest. and that was immediately followed by, you know, these mega floods, worst floods on history. So these, as we get an increase in the frequency and severity of these extreme events, their impacts are cascading across sectors. They're disrupting supply chains and transportation networks and communication networks, and the impacts are aggregating. And this leads us to the next risk, which is the inability of institutions and governance systems to manage these climate risks. We even though we're a very wealthy country and a relatively small population, as we've seen this year, you know, the New South Wales government, you know, floundered when it came, you know, they barely recovered from the bushfires when they just got whacked by 2 floods, and they're about to get hit by a third La Nina season. So, you know, and again, where and this gets down to this whole issue, adaptation. You know, one of the things that we have to adapt are our institutional and governance systems in terms of managing these risks. I mean, what on earth are we going to do with the Great Barrier Reef once we hit 1.5 degrees and we just start seeing massive, relentless coral bleaching? You know, what will happen to the fisheries that are dependent upon it? What will happen to the tourist industry, right? Et cetera, et cetera. You know, so how we respond to these climate risks, how we change what we do, how we change our agriculture, how we change how we manage extreme events. That's what we mean by adaptation. When we talk about adaptation, it's the worse climate change gets, the harder the adaptation is, the bigger the changes have to be, the more costly it is, and the more disruptive it is.
Brendan, just before we move on, and tell me if this isn't the right time to ask it, but I wonder if we could speak briefly to some of these potential changes and losses, and talk about what biophysically, scientifically, caring for country-ish we need to do. Then we can talk about the policy and the institutional responses. But is that okay, or did you have some more material right now?
No, I think that's a good time to.
And that diagram is very helpful. If you could go back to that one you were just speaking to, I think that's excellent, actually.
Yeah.
So just a couple of quick questions, just from my own common knowledge. So please forgive me if the questions are a bit, I don't know, ill-informed. But so let's talk for a moment about bushfires and the drying out of the continent. So first of all, last year we had yourself and Will Steffen and a few other amazing people talk to what we called our mini People's Tribunal about the bushfires and what could be done. And I think the thing that really struck me, Brendan, and I'd love you to speak to this, is whilst people keep talking about responding to the big, terrible, horrific size of the fires, and a lot of Western approaches to fire management are hazard reduction, we then have Indigenous people saying, actually, you've got to love country and look after the cool burns and look after that place. And you and others were saying, and also we've got to stop drying out the place and we have to look after our forests. And I actually found that quite inspiring and hopeful, because it means we're not destined to be on fire every frigging dry summer. We can, we could turn things around and be loving our forests and making sure they're damp, wet, beautiful places, even as climate change grips. But could you talk a little bit about that, the forests, the drying out, the fires?
Well, there's the reason why we had the huge bushfire, or the main trigger for that, was the deep drought, winter drought. So, and this is a climate trend. The climate trend is we're getting declining winter rain in Eastern Australia. Rainfall's high. I mean, rainfall's very confusing. It's not like with temperature, everything's just getting hotter, you know.
Yes.
But with rainfall, it's the weather systems that drive the kind of rainfall cycle are getting more intense. There's more energy in the system. The atmosphere is warmer. It can hold more water. Like, it doesn't rain much over Antarctica because the air's too cold to hold any precipitated moisture. And what goes up has to come down. And those regional systems like the El Nino, La Nina cycle, the Indian dipole and the Southern Oscillation they're getting more intense. So the dry, La Nina's drier and hotter, and El Nino's dry and hotter, and La Nina's cooler and wetter, as we've experienced. So when you're in a El Nino, or the particular phase of the Indian dipole as well, we have these very dry winters. So at the end of winter, all the biomass, all the living and dead biomass is bone dry, for want of a better technical term. Technically, its moisture content is like very low, which means it's flammable. Now, under those conditions, the amount of fuel is irrelevant, right? It's not the amount of fuel that's the factor here. It's the dryness, and so burning off dead litter or whatever in winter becomes irrelevant. All these aerial targets, hazard reduction burning, aren't doing anything, because when you because if you think about what happened, in end of 2019, end of this big winter, it was bone dry. Then in spring we had heat waves. So they're two of the factors that make for dangerous fire weather. The third is strong winds, and then you need an ignition point. So now, so in terms of what we can do, well, one thing we can do is stop pretending that we can, that what might have worked in the 1970s for reducing forest fire risk is going to work now. It's not, because the climate's changed, right? And we're going to get more of these deep winter droughts. And so what determines a big dangerous bushfire and a catastrophic bushfire is catastrophic fire weather. It's how drought affected it is, the moisture content of the vegetation, which is a function of drought, how hot it is, and how windy it is. And there's really not anything we can do about that. But there is things we can do to not make the forest even drier than what the weather has made it. And there's very clear evidence now that logging native forests makes the forest dry and more flammable. And that's because whether they're clear felling or selectively logging, they're creating more gaps in the canopy, more sunlight is coming in, and there's more evaporation. And they also disrupt the ground cover, etc., etc. So, and that logging impact is found to be there 70 years after it's logged. So one thing we can do is not log native forests, because that would that is a factor in making the forests more flammable. The other thing and there's certain vegetation types which are naturally very resistant to fire, because they're naturally wet, and rainforests are the obvious one. So the fires were so intense in 2019 that they did burn into some rainforest, but they didn't get actually, and in total area, quite a lot of rainforest burned, but they just burned in from the edges because it was so intense. The core interior forest environment is very damp and moist. So again, we don't want to be fragmenting these kind of forest blocks, because they create edges which are dry and things like this. So again, buffering, revegetation work, bush regeneration work that buffers rainforests and helps create a moisture environment is all really important. And as well as maintaining water in the landscape, maintaining, revegetating natural wetlands. I think many of you might be familiar with what was called chain of ponds in the southern highlands of New South Wales around Braidwood. This big upper catchment of the Shoalhaven, was cleared for agriculture very early on in kind of settlement days, recent settlement days, and they cleared out the kind of mid slopes, which kind of all eroded and flushed out all the creeks. And the creeks used to consist of a nested series of chains of ponds that were really deep, had all this wetland vegetation around them, and they retained a huge amount of water all through, even what have been very deep droughts. But the erosion caused from the land clearing flushed out all the chain of ponds and created all these deep, kind of classic erosion gullies. So again, proper landscape restoration and bush regeneration helps retain moisture in the soil, moisture in the landscape, brings back the natural wetlands, and that just reduces fire risk. Simple as that. So
it's terrific, Brendan.
But the other thing we need to be doing is really being much more realistic about where we build human settlements, right? And where we live and build our places of work. And, putting them in the middle of the forest is not a good idea anymore, right?
Exactly.
So, kind of landscape and spatial planning so that we're not putting people at risk of bushfires, it becomes more important than ever, I think.
Thank you, Brendan. And although I would love to talk about each of these ecosystem areas in depth, we don't have time for that. Could you briefly mention, can human beings help restore kelp? I mean, is it literally a case of people in scuba diving outfits going down and replanting kelp that will grow back quickly? Am I being silly here, or is that possible?
No, I mean, this is, I did mention that.
Yeah, you said it.
Coral reef and kelp are, kelp grows annually, right? Kelp can grow back in a year or two.
Yep.
Coral reef is 10 years. And it's also kind of more, it's not dependent upon, it doesn't have such a complicated, relationship with another organism like coral does.
But if the kelp starts to die out, can we help it, or should we just let it go and come back each year? I know
kelp. Well, the kelp is naturally migrating, right? But further south and things. But we lost a lot. I mean, we lost, I think, 100,000 hectares last couple of years of kelp. But it can be. It's like you can plant trees, you can plant kelp.
Good. That's all I wanted to know.
It's actually, there's a lot of good work being done on kelp regeneration.
Yeah. And very quickly, with the coral, I mean, we know the reef is in terrible trouble. But again, one of the things that's given me a little bit of hope is reading about scientists working out which coral polyps, I think is that how to say it, are able to withstand the heat a little more, and they're trying to replant some in different places. I mean, again, is that right? Am I reading it wrong? Or
yeah, you're reading it right, but I think it's not a solution.
Okay, so the reef is in serious long-term trouble.
The previous government made money for that kind of research because they wanted to be, and the people doing it are doing good research. But all the marine, look, if you want to talk to a marine expert on this, it's Professor Greta Peckel at UTAS.
Okay.
ECL. She can give you, she's a marine ecologist. She's at UTAS, but she works on coral reefs and also kelp. So if you've got a particular interest in that, but she's very, 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 very doubtful that this could fit. It's not feasible to implement at scale. Put it that way.
No, not at scale. Yeah.
And you're trying to pick winners when the only system that's good for doing that's called natural selection and evolution. Like humans are really bad at picking winners.
And we're speeding things up way too much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brendan. I'm aware that the time is ticking past, but could you possibly jump? My next question is fairly broad, and I know that you are a scientist and don't actually work in the direct space of building policy, but I know you know a lot.
Sure. Yeah.
I know you know a lot of what's going on. So I wonder, could you comment on the current federal government's attempts at making new climate laws and whether they go far enough to help us respond to climate change?
Yeah, well, look, this is certainly a landmark bill, and it should be good on them for doing it. And it's great the Australian Parliament, we finally have a climate, legislative climate bill. So that's a very good thing. And there are mechanisms there that kind of allow ambition to be ratcheted up, over time. But, so per se, the bill's a good thing. So I'm not going to criticise that. I think the question is, and they've legislated this 43% emission target by 2030 based on a 2005 baseline. That's okay so long as it's understood to be a floor and not a ceiling. Okay, so 43% reduction of emissions by 2030 against a 2005 baseline is not really enough to be limiting global warming to close to 1.5 degrees. If everyone has to do their kind of fair share of this, and developed countries are meant to be doing, proportionally more than developing countries. So it's at the weak end of the weaker end of ambition. I mean, it's basically twice what the Morrison government was proposing. So that's good, but it's not sufficiently ambition to be in a line with what would be considered to be a kind of a equitable contribution by Australia to the problem of limiting global warming to around 1.5 degrees.
Mm.
We need more than that. In fact, I'll tell you I'll give you some numbers here, because I actually do a lot of policy work, so it's not.
Yes, yes.
It's all fine. So we have roughly around 500 million tonnes of CO2 emissions a year equivalent, right? And if you go back to, if you look what a 43% reduction is, well, from compared to 2005, what it means is over the next years we have to reduce our emissions over that 8 years by about 220 million tonnes, and that's about 30 million tonnes a year. Now, here's an interesting factoid. Emissions from native forest logging alone is 39 million tonnes a year. So we could actually achieve that just by stop logging our native forests.
Wouldn't that be grand? Which
would be great. But, that just gives you an idea that just changing how we manage one aspect of our land would meet that emission target.
Mm.
Without touching fossil fuel emissions. So it's not really a particularly ambitious target. It's not kind of a scientific target. It's a politically negotiated target. It's twice as good as the previous government, and maybe half as good as what it should be.
I love that. That's
That's
understandable. Yeah.
Like scientifically, if you like, what would be a fair share? It'd be 70%, right? Yep. Rather than 43. So it's probably 27% too low.
Okay. No, that's very helpful. Thank you, Brendan. I've got just a couple of final questions, which brings it in terms of scale. We've gone from international down to the national. Yeah. But if we look at ourselves as, not just individuals, but members of households, members of communities, as individuals or as people who are connected to others, what are the very best things we can all do to mitigate and to adapt? I think I noted in my questions to you, Project Drawdown was an excellent initiative with, a lot of good suggestions. Can you tell us, what are the best ways that we can keep up with the kinds of stuff we should do as individuals, households, families? And I think the final question I had was, should we be looking at household and community carbon budgets more seriously so we know what to do?
Yeah. Yeah, well, the short answer is yes, and I've actually doing some work up with some community groups in Mount Tamborine at the moment on this idea of looking at, because the thing about, yes, we need individual action, but we need collective action.
Yep.
For both the mitigation and the adaptation, because both of those require kind of systemic change and also kind of change at scale. So even if you think about adaptation and being resilient, how can a place-based community be resilient in the face of all these impacts? So, my recommendation is that the individual action, I mean, of course, there's individual things we can do.
Yeah.
You know, if you can afford it, you can, if you own a house and can afford it, you can get solar panels on and own an electric vehicle, right? And have all your, you know, if you can afford it, you can buy clean energy, but most people can't afford it at the moment. Most people can't afford an electric vehicle, and
Yeah.
you can put some panels on and feed some clean energy back into the system and all of that. So that's all good to do, but it's really, you know, when we work collectively as a community, that we can see that our individual actions in aggregate, you know, do make a difference. So I'm really interested in this idea, and it's easy to think about when you've got communities of place where people are, like Mount Tamborine, you know, it's like a geographic, the landscape, and there are people who live and work there. So yeah, so we've been talking to them about, well, what about, you know, could the Mount Tamborine community become net zero, right? Because they could, all their energy use could be clean energy, and they've got a lot of landowners who could help increase removals by doing more environmental plannings and things like this. So, you know, you could think about a community of place becoming net zero emissions collectively.
Yeah.
Right? And you can also, and also when you think about adaptation and resilience, again, of course, that's something that needs to be done, you know, collectively. So one of the things there is to kind of have community, and this is something we're very happy to talk more about community-led strategic planning, right? So like local governments do an awful lot of planning, but often they go straight to the operational planning, not the strategic planning, which is like, well, what kind of community do you want? What's your vision? And what are the principles that would guide the kind of development, you know? And if we're going to mitigate and adapt, how do we do that in a way that's fair and equitable to everyone in our community? So there's, you know, I see that the most important, yes, we need this top-down stuff from the government, state and federal governments. That's critical to get these big systemic changes. But I think it's cooperative action at the community level, which is where there's real, you know, where the real meat on the bones is, I think. And
I agree, of course.
Where there's huge potential. So it's not just individuals, it's individuals working in a communities of various kinds to achieve kind of, you know, a net zero emission, climate resilient community, however that community is defined.
Yeah. No, that's actually really perfect segue into the work that we do inside AILA, Brendan, and you know of the Green Prince program. And next month, we actually start preparing 6 different communities around Australia to spend a year or 2 or about 18 months mapping out the Green Prince approach, which starts with place-based, earth-centered, what should our place continue to look like or be like to be healthy, and climate change and those strategies are important. So we'd love to bring you in to at least a couple of those chats. So,
you know, so how people respond to and adapt to climate risks and threats. I mean, that's got to be a conversation with the community.
Yep.
Because otherwise you get maladaptations, or it's unjust for someone, or you end up with what you care about a place being destroyed. And an example, you know, there are many examples of that. So you might have seen the news about Coleroy Beach in Sydney, northern beaches.
What's that?
Sydney.
What happened?
Well, there's a beautiful beach on the northern beaches of Sydney, and there's kind of a cliff, and as there is in northern Sydney beach, is a cliff and a beautiful beach, for a kilometre or so, and very wealthy people live in very beautiful houses on the cliff, and the cliff's being undercut by waves, and you know, in part indirectly from sea level up there, and so they were able to convince the local council to spend a lot of money building a 9-metre high concrete vertical seawall at the base of the cliff.
Oh.
So now when you go to the beach, at the back of you is a 9-metre high, it's either 7 metres, I think it's 9 metres high, kilometre long, concrete seawall. Now, as well as kind of, you know, you don't really want to go to a beach to see a 9-metre high seawall. That's a disaster from an adaptation point of view, because yes, it stops the base of the cliff eroding and their houses tumbling down. But naturally what would happen is that the waves would come and they would break, and whatever was there, you know, it'd be a beach dune or some vegetation would absorb the wave energy, it would just dissipate.
Yeah.
Right? When you put a concrete seawall, all the wave energy just is reflected back, and it erodes the beach.
Yes.
And basically, once you put a concrete seawall, it's bye-bye beach. So,
yeah,
you know, if you had a community-led strategic plan for climate adaptation, I guarantee the community in that local government area would not want their beach destroyed. Right?
No, and this is a huge issue, isn't it, Brendan? Because we know a lot of very wealthy homeowners live along coastal areas because they're beautiful.
That's right.
And they will have a louder voice than others when it comes to the kinds of options for protecting their, instead of a planned retreat, which many places will have to face. So
that's, you know, that's why you need this community-based kind of strategic, we call it community-based strategic resilience and adaptation planning. You know, it's putting in place the values and the principles so that those kind of adverse outcomes don't happen, because otherwise they will. Yeah.
No, that's very exciting, Brendan. And I'm just looking at the time, and I think that might be a good note to actually end on, unless people have any burning questions. I find it interesting. People have been absorbing the information rather than firing off a gazillion questions or comments. So that's very interesting, which is actually a very good sign.
Okay, as long as they're not all asleep.
No, not at all. Not at all. I find in certain topics we've had throughout the month, people have been firing off comments and opinions, whereas this one I can tell they're listening intently. And what I'd like to say to folks is we'll definitely be having Brendan and people in his team invited back over the next 6 to 12 months, because we need this information. We're working on the ground with folks who are looking across all interconnected systems change issues for place. And this is actually one of the top issues that we need to be looking at. And we need to draw in people like Brendan and others to bring their expertise into the system. So I'm really happy, given this is, I think, our 34th webinar this month, to wind up for tonight, but with an invitation to all of you tonight to have a good think about in your communities, you know, what questions and issues are you facing, are you interested in? And do connect with Ayla, Greenprints, and even directly to Brendan and his team at the Climate Beacon. So thank you. And I can see comments coming in now. Yeah, Moretta's saying this has been an incredible session. Thank you very much. Yep, I'm listening. I need these facts. Thank you so much. That's from Kylian. And Jane, thank you so much. This has been the best session for me for some time, listening intently. So I think this idea, Brendan, of communicating the realities of what we're facing is much needed, and we might continue these conversations, obviously.
Happy to. Okay.
Thank you, Brendan. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone for joining us. And Brendan, have a lovely evening, and we'll see you very soon. Thank you to everybody.
Okay.
We've got another webinar at lunchtime tomorrow around environmental education. So if you do want to join us, that would be lovely. Good night, Brendan. Thank you, everybody.